Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. My name is Elisa, and if you've never been here before, this channel is all about me creating my dream wardrobe, and I'm taking you along for the ride so maybe you can recreate some of the things that I make for yourself at home. That's my intro. And now to the task at hand. This week I'm gonna make another denim dress. I just made a denim dress recently and I fell in love with the fabric. It's just so much fun to work with. So I decided to make another one, but this time with a very light denim color, a very different weight of denim as well. It's a little bit stretchy, but not very. So in the end, we're gonna end up with something completely different. I drew up what I am planning to make and it looks a little something like this. So it's going to have puff sleeves, it's going to have a very deep V-neck neckline, and it's also going to have a very interesting and long collar. I also took away a couple of learnings from my last project, which is to definitely wash your denim before you start sewing it up, because first of all, it smells. The indigo blue color that is often used to dye denim has a very strong smell, so you do want to get rid of that. Also, the denim tends to shrink after it's been washed, so if you sew it up before you wash it, you might end up with something that's a little bit shorter than you initially planned it to be. And number 3, the denim dye, the indigo, also bleeds like crazy. I had like very dark blue hands working with the dark blue denim that I used last time, and I want to avoid that this time. I'm going to be using this light blue colored denim, which I really love. Bought it at the same shop here in London, and I already created a mock-up for this dress using calico fabric. So I knew what changes I wanted to make. So basically this was the first iteration, and there were quite a lot of things that I decided that I wanted to change. For example, the collar shape, but also the closing mechanism of the whole thing. But before I go into any detail here, I'm gonna show you how I created the pattern for this dress on a miniature version like I usually do. And then we can jump straight into the sewing process. So let's go. All right, let's create this pattern. You know that I like showing you this on a miniature version using these little printed bodice blocks, the front as well as the back. You can create these to scale for yourself to your own measurements using a tutorial that I posted earlier this year. I'm going to link it in the description box as I usually do. If you're drawing this to scale, the things you are going to need is probably some sort of paper. You can use baking sheets, but you can also use craft paper, as well as a measuring tape, a pattern master to draw straight lines and curves, some paper scissors, don't use your fabric scissors, and a pencil. When I do this to scale, I like using a Sharpie. I'm going to use a pencil, this little guy here, as well as a curved ruler to do this on this miniature version. As I said, I have my 2 bodice blocks here, one for the front and one for the back, and I created these lines here on my piece of paper. Consider this one the center front and this one the center back. The first thing I'm going to do is to create a waistline between these 2 lines that I'm just going to draw as a guideline, and this is where I'm going to line up both my center front on the front and the center back on the back. And the first thing I'm going to do to actually modify these bodice blocks into a dress pattern is to trace them. Specifically, I need the shoulders for both front and back, as well as the darts and the side seams and armholes. So let's do it. So I just traced the areas that I needed. What I also want to make sure is that I mark the width of my darts on my waistline for both front and back, as well as the end of my darts for the shoulders and bust area. And the last thing I want to take note of is my arm side line for both front and back. This line is important as it's going to mark where our neckline ends and how deep the cleavage for this dress is. Let's mark the center front and center back. And now we can start to modify. The first thing you want to understand is how long your dress is supposed to be. What you do for that is you take your tape measure and measure from the nape of your neck down on your body and get an understanding of how long you want the dress to be. For me, it was about 65 centimeters, and that's because it was a mini dress. That's probably the shortest I will ever go for a dress. From the nape of our neck, we measured down our center front line, and for me, I measured down 65 centimeters. Now, what I did then is I created the length of my dress. This is how long my dress is going to be. So I'm just going to square out and create a perpendicular line to both front and back to create the length of my dress. The next thing we need is to understand where our hip line is. The hip line is somewhere between the hem and the waistline. Your hip is the widest part of your body, usually, and it's approximately where your legs start. Where your legs start is where your bum hits, and that's usually the widest part of your body. So you measure down from your waistline and find that point. And this is where we're going to draw in a guideline for our hips. This is the same for the front and the back. Now we can work on our skirt. We want to have a skirt that's a little bit wider on the hem than it is on the waist/hip line. So what we need to do first is to understand what's the widest part of our hips and mark it on the hip line. For that, you take 1/4 of your hip circumference plus 2 to 3 centimeters for the front, and you mark it on this line. And then you take 1/4 of your hip circumference plus a little bit more ease, say 2 to 4 centimeters on your back. Once you've found those points, you can take them and find the middle. Find the middle of these 2 points and mark it on your hemline, which is this line. Find the middle between the end of your front and the end of your back skirt and mark it on the hemline, and then you can already connect these points with the widest part of your hips. Going forward from there, you can use your curved ruler and connect your waist, which is the narrowest part of your body, with the widest part of your body on the hip line. And that is basically already the outline of our dress. So you might remember that we marked the width of our darts on the waistline. So this is where we are going to continue. We can now start to draw in the contour darts on this etui dress. The contour darts are basically going to follow the shoulder dart, the waist dart, and then they're going to fade out into the skirt for both the front and the back. The first thing you want to do is to find the midpoint of your dart width for both the front and back. Find that point and mark it on your hemline. Draw a perpendicular line to your hemline up to your hip line, as this is going to be the end of our darts, which is basically just a seam. Now the next thing you do is you can take your curved ruler and start to connect all of the marked points with each other to create these contour darts. Let me show you how I do it. Here we go, all our contour darts are drawn in. Now we can focus on the center front button tape as well as collar. So we are going to continue to consider the center front our center front, as this is the middle of our body, which is also the center front for our button tape. My button tape was a total width of 4 centimeters. So what I did is I placed my ruler like so and applied 4 centimeters to one side as well as 4 centimeters to the other side. I did that first on my arm side line and then on my hemline. I then connected all of these points to draw in my button tape. Now this isn't the actual button tape piece. This is just a small part of it which is cut onto the center front piece of our etui dress. What we need to do is we need to mirror this piece to the left so we have something that we can overturn and create the actual button tape. So this chevron piece is its own piece, which you're going to cut separately and use to overturn the button tape in the end. And this line is really just where the end of the button tape hits. And you're going to place your buttons onto the button tape like this. Right, so we drew in our button tape. Now the next thing we can do is to finish up the neckline, which you can just do by using your curved ruler and connecting the tip of your shoulder with your center front and give it a very natural, organic shape. And those are all of the pieces for the main dress. Now we can continue with our collar. Let me whip up a straight line down here. We are going to continue to consider this one our center back, and we're going to cut our collar on the fold. The first thing that you need to do is you need to measure the distance between your center front and your center front shoulder tip, as well as your center back shoulder tip, which is effectively the same point as this one, and your center back. So this distance plus this distance is half of your collar. This measurement you are going to apply on this straight line here. Once you have found this, you can create a perpendicular line 2 centimeters down from there. You can then take your curved ruler and connect that point with your straight that you've drawn earlier and draw a very shallow curve. We now need to suss out how high we want the stand of our collar to be. Since this is a very, very oversized collar, the stand of the collar is higher than usual. It also doesn't have a band to attach it to the dress, so the band and the stand is in one piece. I would recommend a height between 8 and 10 centimeters. Take that measurement and apply it to your center back. You can now square out from your center back with a perpendicular line like so. And to finish off the collar, you apply your ruler, so you are at the tip of your collar down here, and then you find about a 35-degree angle. This is really up to taste. The more steep you finish off your collar here, the more severe it's going to look. The less steep it is, the less severe it's going to look. I was at about a 35-degree angle, and that's the collar. So let's cut all of these pattern pieces. All of these pieces are going to be placed on your fabric following the grain line. So all of these pieces are done. Now the last piece to consider is the sleeve. And if you've seen any of my previous tutorials, you know that I like using a bit of a sleeve hack. I don't have a proper way to construct a sleeve, but I have a way to construct the sleeve that works every time. So what I like doing is I use a piece of paper and I fold it down the middle like so. I then mark an arbitrary line on this piece of paper and consider this my shoulder tip. Down the fold, I need to apply the measurement of the tip of my shoulder to, for this dress specifically, my elbow, as this is how long the sleeve is going to be. So find that measurement, measure it down from your shoulder, and then square out in a 90-degree angle. This sleeve was a bit of a bell sleeve situation, so consider how much volume you want at the end of your sleeve in your cuff area. I decided to go for about 1.5 as much width as I had on the widest part of my arm, and mark that down here. To suss out where the widest part of your arm is, you measure down from your shoulder to the end of your armhole, and you can draw in a guideline here. And on this guideline, you're going to take the circumference of the widest part of your arm plus a little bit of ease. You can add maybe 2.5 to 3 centimeters there. You can then connect these 2 points with each other to get the side seam of your sleeve. And the last thing you do is you connect the end of your armhole, which is this point, with your shoulder tip in a shallow S curve, like so. That's really just a hack on how to create a pattern for sleeve, and it usually works every time. You can cut this piece and then fit it in the sewing process. And because this is a bell sleeve, I also like to create a bit of a curve down here at the cuff to give it a more natural shape. Once we cut this, we have a beautiful symmetrical sleeve piece. And the cuff, as you might know, is really just a rectangle like so, that's double as high as you want your cuff to be, and fits exactly around the point of your arm that the sleeve is going to end. So it needs to have the circumference of around where your elbow is for this specific sleeve, plus 2 to 3 centimeters seam allowance. And this, my friends, is the pattern for this dress. It's a little bit more complicated than what we usually do on this channel, but now let me show you how to sew this dress to create the finished product. So the first step is going to be to pin together the entire bodice, which consists out of a bunch of pieces. So what I want to make sure is that I mark all of the notches that I need, so along the waist seams in all of my pieces, and then potentially also marking the length of the dress, because that's going to help me to sew the hem later. Notches are your best friend, so don't be lazy. Okay, and then I'm going to start with my back piece. And pinning together all of the pieces is where the notches come in, so you can align all of the waist seam notches, etc. Alright, all the pieces are pinned together, and now I can sew them, just sewing along these seams. Alright, so I've just pressed all of the seams on my skirt pieces, and to complete the front of the dress I need to work on this bust piece here, because I have 2 darts on each side, which means I want to mark the end point of my dart by placing a needle onto my pattern piece, and then I can mark this on one side, 2 sides, so I can definitely be sure that my darts are going to be symmetrical. And I definitely want to make sure that my dart ends where I marked the fabric earlier. And I'm going to, instead of backstitch the dart, I'm going to tie up the loose ends so I can be sure to have a super nice finish on the outside. So the darts are in. Look how cute these bust pieces look. I love these 2 darts together. I think it looks really nice and clean. And now I can attach the bust pieces to the skirt pieces, because they are going to go into this curve here, and they're gonna go in so that I have a little bit of leeway here for overturning and giving it a clean finish. So I'm probably gonna make it so that the second dart here is gonna line up with this seam. So as always, just placing one piece onto the other, right sides touching, starting with the points that you want to definitely align, and then moving on from here. Like this. And now I'm gonna do the same thing on the other side and take it to my sewing machine, trying to sew this in without any pleats. That's gonna be the challenge for this part. All of the pieces are assembled, which means I can now put together front and back. And that's going to happen very simply by placing the back on a table in front of me, right side facing up, which means outside facing up. And then I'm going to place the accordion front piece, right sides touching onto the back piece. And now I'm going to pin together the shoulders and the side seams. Alright, this is what we're looking at now. The dress so far is assembled and I really love this shape. This looks awesome. Very happy with this, but I have to finish up now because that's all the time I've set aside today for sewing. And I'll see you next time. Good morning. It is the next day that I'm working on the denim dress and I'm feeling super excited. It's quite early in the morning and I got a lot of stuff to do still. So first up, I'm gonna work on my collar piece, which is quite big. I think I want to put that in and then add my sleeves, and then lastly I can work on my front closure and the hem. Okay, so I just assembled my collar by just placing right sides touching and then also understitched the seam allowance into the undercollar so I have a nice crisp look on the outside. I also cut back a little bit my neck hole here for the collar, which is going to be attached to the neck hole now. So what I'm going to do is I will place the collar so that the outside of the collar is right sides touching with the outside of my dress. However, I'm gonna flop it around like this and then start pinning it in all the way around my collar. So that's gonna take a minute. Okay, so I've just pinned the collar in and this is a little bit more complicated. So this is the front of my dress here. And what I've done is I made sure that the seam allowance here is folded in and that these seams completely match up. So the seam where the bust piece is fitted in and the end of my collar need to match up completely. That's the important bit. And now I'm gonna sew this in. So I just put it on my mannequin to check if everything was all right, and everything was not all right. I put it in so that the under collar is up. It's supposed to be this side up. So good thing I didn't top stitch this yet. I will have to redo this part. Okay, so the collar is pinned in correctly now. And what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna top stitch it closed, basically. So when I do this, the collar is finished. All right, so since the collar is in, I'm now gonna focus on the sleeves, which I haven't yet cut even. So first up, I need to measure out the circumference of my armhole to decide on the width of the shoulder curve on the sleeve, and then I'll take it from there. Pieces for the sleeves look as such. They're quite simple. What I need to do is I need to gather the width of the cuff on the sleeve to the width of the actual cuff, which is this. I'm going to create the cuffs for starters. So I'm simply going to leave them as I cut them, so right sides touching, and then I'll stitch this length. Now just to check, and it looks like it's the right width, there's enough give, which means I can turn this around. So cuffs are pressed and they still fit, they're comfy, they're the same, they're identical. And up next, I'm going to sew the side seams of my sleeves. Okay, so the cuffs are done, the sleeves are closed, and now I can open them up like this and add a basting stitch around the cuff on my sleeve, which means I'm gonna set my machine to the biggest stitch length available, and then I'll add a seam around here without closing the beginning or the end. All right, now all of this is done. I can grab one end and start to gather up this cuff. I'll just quickly gather it up a little bit, and then I'll have to take my cuff and adjust the width exactly to the width of the cuff to make the two match up. Now that I've attached it like this with the wrong side looking out, I'm gonna fold it over the way I pressed it earlier, and then I'm gonna fold it over once again and pin it down so I can top stitch it. Alright, this was a bit more complicated, or not complicated, but harder to sew than I thought it was going to be, just because it's really hard to get to that point with the sewing machine. But I just took it step by step very slowly, and it ended up looking quite neat. So I'm going to repeat that now with the second sleeve. What I'm gonna do before I attach my button tape is I'm gonna fold over my hem and finish this by attaching it with interfacing, because I don't want a visible seam on the outside. I've done this before actually on the dress I'm wearing right now, where I just pressed this down with interfacing, and it's lasted ever since, and I'm like 99% sure I've watched this since. So that's what I'm gonna do first. All right, now the hem is pressed up with the interfacing, as I said, so it's fixated and it looks really neat and crisp on the outside without an actual seam there. And now I can try my hand at the first button tape side. So I'm gonna grab this piece here and I'm going to place it under my actual dress like this, so that the right side of this facing is facing the left side of the dress. And I'm doing this so once I overturn it, the good side, this side, is on the outside. So let me pin that in. So my thinking is that I'm going to sew this in place by sewing a seam from this point over here and down here. Okay, now the moment of truth. When I overturn this, what does it look like? So it's coming back as I had hoped it would. And then I would overturn this again. And down here, what's the situation? Just flip it up and hide it. Yeah, that works. It works. It works. My theory pans out. I always love it when that happens. So that worked out, which means I can go and take it to my iron and press it, so I get some crisp corners. But before I do this, I'm going to understitch the seam allowance so we have a crisp edge. I just took this to my iron, and as I said, I overturned it, and as you can see, I basically just folded it over once again, also down here, and made sure that I'm meeting the red line that I drew first with the edge of my button tape. And now I can top stitch this down technically. I'm gonna pin it in place first though, and just tidy it up a little bit more.